Hey everybody, CyberTao back with you. We're closing in on being done with our hanging pawn course. We're going to take a look at one or two examples that sort of bring it all together. These are examples that, in my opinion, sort of completely encapsulate everything we've looked at how to face off against hanging pawns. Today's example, this is a game between Boris Gelfand against Anatoly Karpov back in 1994. Linares 1994, I believe this was the Linares where Karpov went ham and won by like 2 points. I might be wrong on that. But anyways, excellent game from Karpov here. Karpov's black, yeah, Gelfand's white. Gelfand played e4. Caro-kann, so of course Karpov switched the caro-kann in response to his matches with Kasparov. Before Kasparov, he played 1e5 fairly exclusively against 1e4. Kasparov broke through his defensive trenches enough in the Roy Lopez that he made the switch to the caro-kann in the early 90s, and he sort of helped the fashion switch towards the caro-kann in a heavy way. Now it's one of Black's most popular choices against d4. Not as popular as Sicilian, but fairly close. EXD5. So this was somewhat in fashion back in the early 90s. Of course, opening fashion is incredibly fickle. And c4. So the reason White took on d5 to play c4. Sort of a beginner's way of playing, although you could say that might be a bit unfair. This would be the exchange variation. This has never had much of a following at the top level. You occasionally see it in some Grandmaster play as just a quick way of getting away from all theory and just playing a game of chess. White doesn't really have anything here, though. Knight c6. Knight e6, the most important thing, if Black can't play e6, locking in the white square bishop, because this truly would be just an excellent exchange variation for white. This is basically a queen's gamma decline exchange variation, except this light square bishop is trapped, which means white has a solid advantage here. But Black just plays knight f6 and bishop g4, and Black is fine here. It'll be a complex game, so it's certainly a way for white to get away from theory and get an interesting game of chess on the board. But objectively, white just doesn't have any advantage, and Black is... I'm not even sure white really sets Black any objective problems. White has fairly comfortable play. c4, though, this is the Panov-Botvinnik. I've always had a sneaking regard for this, for the white side. I don't play 1e4 as white. If I switch to 1e4, I would certainly consider this as part of my repertoire. It's just an easy way of getting an isolated queen pawn, and if you like playing with an isolated queen pawn, I would say it's preferable to get a position like this than the usual caro-kann slog, and either the Capablanca bishop f5 variation, or some of the lines of the advance where there's a huge amount of theory. c4 shortcuts a lot of theory and just gets white a reasonable game of chess on the board, with decent chances of aggressive play, I must say. And c3, e6. So this is the positional way of playing. This sort of connects with a couple other openings, including the Nimzo. So if you want your repertoire to be more interconnected, and you play those openings, e6 would be the right choice here. Knight c6 would be a fairly aggressive way of playing, one offbeat way for white to respond. Bishop c4 is normal. If d5, h6 is an important subtlety here. This is a balanced position, but it's certainly interesting. Bishop c4, h6. And this is a balanced isolated queen pawn position. So Black has gained this time with h6. The bishop on e3 isn't terribly optimal. And the bishop on d6 is a little bit more aggressive than, say, on e7. And the fact that e7 is clear means knight e7, knight d5 is a possible maneuver from Black. So this is a balanced isolated queen pawn. It'll be a good struggle to come. So knight c6 is viable and maybe a little bit more spicy. e6 is perfectly viable, though. 3. Bishop b4. Bishop a7 is the more passive move. Bishop a7 is more popular, but I think it's less assertive and allows white a greater choice of what to go with here. Taking on d5, I think, is correct. If white plays bishop d3 first, then Black can gain a tempo. And then he wins the usual battle of the tempo on c4, whereas taking on d5 immediately avoids that tempo loss. Bishop d3, another way of playing would be Botvinnik's bishop c4, or Botvinnik style bishop c4. Maybe a little bit less good here. Bishop d3 is normal. Castle. And this is a standard isolate queen pawn position. We've looked at this this exact position several times in our isolate queen pawn and hanging pawn course. Subjectively, I prefer white, just because I think white has good play here. But this sort of position has been fought thousands of times. The normal modern mainline is bishop f6 here. It's a good fight to come. Bishop e4 is just more assertive. Sort of restricts white's options. Bishop d3. This acquiesces to losing that battle of the tempo in c4, which I don't particularly care for. 65, I think, is better. Just a quick. This is a fairly normal opening line from here. The bishop on d2 isn't ideal, but the bishop on b4 isn't ideal either. That bishop is most likely going to have to retreat because you typically don't want to just give away the bishop pair. So the bishop will retreat, and it's a normal isolated queen pawn from this point. Bishop d3. I mean, this is seen all the time, but in my opinion, from this precise variation, white doesn't have to acquiesce to losing that tempo. Castle and b6. And fittingly, we have reached the Karpov variation of the Nimzo Indians. So this is a black main line against the Rubinstein Nimzo Indian of after bishop e4, 4e3. When Karpov first popularized this in the 70s and 80s, he really started theoretical work on it. It didn't have much theory, and he just sort of won point after point with it, because it's a very straightforward way of playing against an isolated pawn. It's a very strong way. It hasn't lost any of its strength, but it has so much opening theory attached to it now that has quite a few drawing lines attached to it, which, if you're a 2700 Grandmaster playing in a round robin, getting a draw with black isn't a crisis. If you're a 2300 playing in a weekend Swiss against someone 200 points lower than you that still knows opening theory, a forced draw line isn't acceptable. You have to play for a win. So it depends on your exact circumstances, but there's certainly nothing unsound about the Karpov Nimzo Indian. This is a super solid line from black. Really, it's solving the problem of the slight square bishop. And in so many of these isolated queen pawn situations, solving that light square bishop is an incredibly important problem. And if black can solve it immediately, he's going to be at least equal in a lot of cases. Knight b7, this is another way of playing. It seems to have less theory attached to it. This would probably be my choice as black, just to avoid opening theory. h6, kick the bishop, and then queen a5. Black scores really well from here. I think this is an underrated option in theory. It's not been seen as often as some of the other options, but the computer likes it, and the game results are promising. Black's just immediately getting pressure on white's position. That's it. I mean, this bishop can still drop back to maybe d6 if we need to, or you can just trade on c3 and play b6, and this queen does a pretty good job of pressuring squares over here on the queen side. It's certainly more useful than being on d8, where it's just the knight on 6 is then pinned to the queen. So another option if you're looking to dodge the Karpov. There's no objective reason to dodge b6, aside from opening taste. Bishop e5, bishop b7, bishop c3. So this is not forced at all, and I think giving up the bishop pair like this without provocation is extraordinarily dangerous. You know, with black, we're not even getting a tempo of a3 from white. We're just giving away the bishop pair straight away. I think objectively this isn't a great choice. I think knight bd7 is better, just continuing to mobilize. One way of playing, there's some more aggressive lines from white that end in forced draws, but and this is a very comfortable isolated queen pawn for black. The light square bishop is completely solved. In so many of these isolated queen pawns, that means black is doing just fine. The rook on c1 doesn't make a lot of sense in this position. And black can just continue to unwind with moves like knight d5, trying to trade some minor pieces off the board. Black is very comfortable. Bishop c3, again, the bishop pair is an asset. And giving away the bishop pair without any provocation, you need a lot of justification for that. And here, black gets the hanging pawns to play against, but he doesn't get really any pressure against the hanging pawns, which means the hanging pawns aren't counterbalancing the bishop pair. So in this situation, white's just getting the bishop pair more or less for free. You see bishop d3, retreating off the c file, so a move like rook c8 doesn't hit the c3 pawn. Rook c1. This is all pretty much best play. And this looks like a very good hanging pawns for black. Notice that the knight on d7 is actually quite passive here. It doesn't have any squares to jump to. In a lot of these hanging pawns, we would rather develop that knight to c6 so it can pirouette to, say, a5 to attack the hanging pawn when it arrives on c4. In this situation, because the bishop's on g5, we did need to support that knight, so the queen can move and remove that pin. But that means that this knight on d7 is very passively placed. White has a very active position. White has the bishop pair. His light-squared bishop is a very strong piece. And these pawns aren't under pressure just yet, which means a weakness isn't a weakness unless it can be attacked. And if the hanging pawns aren't being attacked, it means they're not counterbalancing the other assets of White's position. So this is a very favorable hanging pawns for White. This is a very strong attacking position. Queen d6. This is not economical. Black needs to continue to mobilize. A better play would be knight h5. You see this in some other lines of the Queen's Gambit, except in declined against the isolated pawn. There was that Anatoly Karpov game that we looked at where knight h5 was played. Just pirouetting this knight into a better spot on f4, plus it gives this knight on d7 access to the f6 square, so it actually activates both the knights. One potential line, f3 to blunt out the strong light-squared bishop and give this bishop a hidey hole. And White is White is definitely for choice here. So White has the bishop pair. These hanging pawns are actually quite strong. They're controlling useful central space. At an opportune time, White can always find a way to play g3 and f4 to keep this knight away. But Black has some counterplay, and these knights are actually a little bit active at this point, so this isn't nearly a hopeless position for Black at all. Queen d6 doesn't accomplish any of those things. It leaves the knights passive, and it just shifts the queen, and that doesn't accomplish anything. Bishop h4, knight e5 is the most accurate. Rook takes the best. Notice d takes doesn't work. And this is a better ending for White, but it's not as good as the other option. Rook xe5 is more accurate. 5, a6, and then a very thematic move for White here, a4. If White waits a move, knight b6 comes, and then Black gets that annoying light square blockade. He can play queen d7, bishop d5, knight c4. A4 breaks that apart immediately. And this is hardly even a pawn sacrifice from White. You know, Black's extra pawn is this pawn on a6, which really isn't an extra pawn at all. This c pawn is passed and quite strong. White still has a bishop pair. White has an edge in central space. This is a much better position for White. He has overwhelming compensation for the pawn. I mean, it's barely a pawn sacrifice. So bishop h4, it's not bad, but I think knight e5 is certainly more testing. Rook f c8. This is the wrong rook. That leaves that rook on a8 quite sad. Rook f d8 seems better. Knight f8. This is a very common reorganization. In a position like this, you really don't care if White takes an f6. Those aren't bad double pawns. They would just sort of help reinforce the king side. And then Black can follow knight g6 here. This is still better for White. White's got the bishop pair. White has more central space. White has more activity. Nothing Black has is really counterbalancing those factors just yet. But this is still a solid position. Rook fc8 really leaves this rook on a8 out to dry. And the c-file is not even that fruitful for Black here. Bishop g3. Queen a3. This is putting the queen way out of the game. I think this is completely overestimating the play that Black is going to get on the queen side and completely underestimating White's potential play on the king side. Queen d5 is more circumspect, just keeping the Black queen involved in the game. Queen a3, c4, completely correct. Just daring Black to take that pawn on a2. Karpov declines. If Black takes, this is very dangerous. So c5, I managed to find this move after a few minutes of looking at the position, completely shutting off the Black queen from getting back into the fight. This is very dangerous for Black. The point is, if Black takes, a6 is really the only safe square, but then knight d6, this wins material. If bishop d5, rook e3, threatening discovery, rook b1, And then bishop a6, and then black is more or less forced to give up that rook on c8. If black tries to hold on to the material, c6, then black takes on c6, suddenly the queen on b2 is completely trapped. This is not a tactical accident. In variation, and you see this in some variations like the Fianchetto King's Indian. When a queen goes on a pawn-grabbing adventure like this, it's not a tactical accident that you end up in a position like this. It's sort of part and parcel of the risk that you're taking when you go pawn-grabbing with your queen. So even without the idea of trapping the queen, white has oodles of compensation. He's got the bishop pair, he's got a big edge in central space, he's got good kingside attacking chances. But this sequence of playing c5 to seal off the black queen from getting back to freedom is incredibly thematic, and this is what gives white a humongous edge from here. So c4, Karpov declines the pawn with knight f8. I think that's practically correct. Knight e5, rook e3, threatening discovery, and then queen f8. So black admits defeat, runs off without the pawn. This is an incredibly depressing position for black. So white's got the bishop pair. White's even managed to start one half of a rook lift to assault the king side. Black still has some defensive force in front of the king side, so his king side isn't deserted. But I wanted to include this example to look at because it shows how to rescue a position once it's gone bad. You're not always going to get a perfect position against hanging pawn. Sometimes you'll misplay it and get a downright terrible position. And you have to be able to know how to put the defensive brakes on and work against the king side initiative. I don't like storybook, textbook perfect examples of games. I like those muddy, warty, imperfect examples because they really show more of what a normal game will look like. f4. So Gelfand immediately goes wrong here. This is putting white's light squares at huge risks, and it creates sort of a quasi-outpost on f5 for black's pieces. h4 is the right pawn move. So now the h-pawn is just threatening to trundle up the board and detonate black's kingside stability. One example. Then after d5, white can add a strong passed d-pawn to his list of assets. He's still threatening h6 to detonate black's kingside stability. All of his pieces are stronger than black counterparts, but this pawn on d5 is passed, it's strong, and it's completely shutting out black's light square bishop from play. White can sort of combine the threat of pushing this d-pawn with threats against black's kingside to sort of stretch his defenses apart. This should be a technically winning position for white. f4 is a huge positional error. Queen d8, bishop b1. He was threatening more or less a repetition there. Bishop g5. And then b5. And I also wanted to give this example because it shows an example of the b-pawn break when it's incorrect. So this is a completely typical move, and it's the sort of move you always want to be looking for. But here it's simply not correct, because white is the one with all of the activity. And giving white more lines and more space isn't working out here so well. When you play that b-pawn break, you need to be able to immediately take advantage of the blockade and generate threats of your own. Because black is so passive here, it's harder for him to accomplish that. Just rook c7, holding serve is the best move here. White goes immediately wrong. So this bishop on b1 is one of the most important pieces on the board. So trading it off for that passive knight on g6 just can't be right. Just c5, gobbling up that space, that's a huge pass c-pawn, completely correct. One example of how this could go, bishop d5, f5, always look to your pawn breaks, g4. White's just completely winning here. The key to this, after c5, white continues to look to open the position and take advantage of his trumps. He's got the edge in mobilization, he has the edge in piece activity. That's that flashing red signal to open the position and take advantage of that. So f5 is just a key move. And white's just completely winning here. Bishop x6 is just complete positional suicide. That bishop on b1 is incredibly important. Without it, all of white's light squares are going to be incredibly weak. And it makes b5 make a lot more sense without that light square bishop on the board. So rook c7. Notice rook h3 had a threat, sort of reminiscent of Ayakin. White White wins with a cheapo, but rook c7 guards the f7 square. d5. This is an excellent positional sacrifice, and this is a good example of both sides fighting with good positional methods in this case. c5 would be exactly what black would be looking for. And this is exactly what you're looking for when you play this b-pawn break, this instant capitalization on those weaknesses from those blockaded hanging pawns. And this is all made possible because white decided to trade his light square bishop off the board. Now, this is a positionally devastating position for black. Black is completely positionally winning here. d5 looks to destabilize that. So it's a pawn investment, but it's looking to keep this light square bishop out of the game. It's looking to keep this... Whoop, so black takes, and then white plays c5, which is completely correct. It keeps this c-pawn as an asset. It keeps this light square bishop as something, as a weakness rather than a strength, and it gives white an additional outpost on d4 for either a rook or a queen. This is really an excellent choice from white. This is an impressive play from Gelfand. This is completely positionally thematic. And it's striking how strong players lose their material fetish quite quickly. You would much rather have this position as black with equal material than this position where you're up a pawn, but all of your pieces are just completely miserable. Now, this is practically, I would say this is close to balance, maybe a little bit better for white, but practically, I think anyone would prefer to have white here, just because white has all the activity here. Bishop c8, activating this bishop. Rook b3. So this is going wrong, and this is a good example of how you need to always be fighting for the key squares on the board. You don't want to allow your opponent the opportunity to just set up harmlessly. g4. This has some kingside attacking elements, but it's mostly a sound positional move. So this pawn is taking advantage of, it's taking the f5 square away from this light square bishop, which keeps the e4 square under white's control. It's sort of a chain reaction. It controls the f5, which controls e4, which keeps this bishop under wraps. Always be looking to fight for the important squares on the board. Don't allow your opponent to just take up posts with his pieces without consequence. One example I've had go queen e8, h7, and this is a completely crazy position. So now white's the one that's a pawn up, but black is a huge amount of counterplay. He's got the second rank, he's got this weak a pawn to stare at. All three results are possible. This is a tactically crazy position. Rook b3 just allows black to take control. Queen e8. Again, strong players lose their material fetish really quickly. It's important to control the position and gain strong outposts for your pieces rather than worry about weak pawns. This pawn on b5 is incredibly weak, and unless we get to a king and pawn ending, it's inconsequential. Bishop f5, mobilize, get your pieces out, get them active. And now queen e8, now that we've got our pieces mobilized. 7, c4, and I would say black has a nice edge here. So this knight can reroute to e6 to chase away that blockade and to hit the c-pawn. This bishop on e4 is stronger than either of white's minor pieces. Black has a very nice edge here. Queen e8 is just passive. It's passively guarding this weak b-pawn instead of getting the pieces mobilized. Queen d4, that's a mistake. Rook e3 immediately makes black regret moving his queen to e8. Probably the best move is just to move back to d8. Bishop f5, so black's doing okay now. Queen c8, Queen f8, this is just way too passive. Rook c8's better, aiming at that weak c-pawn and coordinating with this bishop to control the g4 square. Bishop x f6. So this is a very bad transformation position. So not only does it improve this g-pawn by controlling the e5 square, but it's turning into bishop versus knight when this bishop has much better prospects than this knight, especially without the e5 square. This bishop on g5 still has a use, and there's no reason to trade it off, improve black's pawn structure, and turn it into bishop versus knight when the bishop is much better than the knight in this particular position. c6 is much better, so it's activating this passed c-pawn and keeping this knight in a strong e5 square. One example. 4. So that's the right liquidation. Black wants to trade these knights off the board and leave this bishop on the board. And this will be a draw. I mean, white's going to have the slightly less comfortable side of a draw. I think black's microscopically better, just because I think this bishop's a little bit better than that bishop. But that's a small detail. This should be just a draw. Bishop x f6, just catastrophic. Bishop e4, king g7 is better. Bishop e4 doesn't necessarily throw away the advantage, especially when you compare these two minor pieces. This bishop on e4 is super strong. This knight on f3 is just mid, to use a cool girl phrase. Knight d2, f5, reinforcing the bishop. That's very strong. a5, getting the pawns moving. Queen b4, that's a big mistake. That's allowing white to completely coordinate. I think that throws away nearly all of white's advantage, if not all of it. Or black's advantage. b4, just keep the pawns moving. You've set A with a5. Now just say B with b4. c8. King h7, just sort of a nice consolidating safety move. Black still has a good chance to convert his pawn here. You know, he has every bit of a chance to convert that. Knight b3. So now the knight's able to get to this key d4 square. That's the major failing of queen b4. And the queen just comes back, so this is clearly a loss of time. Queen f2, just complete mistake. It's being passive at a point where there's no reason to be passive. It's move 37, so I'm guessing Gelfand was probably in time trouble. To you young folk, back in the old days of the 90s, the time control was around move 40. So when you look at older games from the 80s and 90s, if you see mistakes happen around the move 35 mark, almost always that's due to time trouble, and I'm guessing that's the case here. Rook h3, just a really obvious move, threatening mate and getting counterplay. And then queen f2. Queen h4. And all the check squares are covered by the queen, so this is just getting counterplay. This actually puts black on the edge. Black is still able to hold. Queen a7. This is actually just barely holding. One example. Okay. Queen x g6 just doesn't work. Queen g7 gets the queens off, and this is a winning position for black. But white can just take a perpetual here. Black can't dodge it. King can't come back because of rook h7, but if the king goes to d6, knight x b5. So actually, rook h3 and then queen f2, that would actually test black and put black on the brink, whereas queen f2, again, to reiterate something I feel like it repeats every week or every day, which is because it should be repeated, don't play passively. You get into the most trouble when you just play passively and don't seek your own play. And this is something Gelfand is doing here. He's just playing sort of a solid, basic move out of instinct, whereas rook h3 gets active counterplay, puts black to the test. Be the one making active moves. Don't just play passively and hold on to your stuff. Queen f2 just passively holds on to this pawn without getting active counterplay. b4, black is getting active play of his own. a4 just continues. Bishop d3 takes the b5 square into custody, and now black is just threatening bishop c4, cutting off that rook. b2, c4. And now this is just a completely winning position for black. You know, black has completely destroyed all of white's stability. This knight on d4 isn't stable anymore. This bishop on c4 is cutting both this knight on d4 is hanging because the bishop on c4, the bishop on c4 cuts off the communication of these rooks. Black is just completely winning here. c3, rook e8, going to the newfound open file. Rook e3, rook c7 was more accurate. If knight f3, and black's just going to take an f3 and mate. But rook e3 is still winning. This one, queen e4, and this is completely overwhelming. This is far afield from our hanging pawns coverage, but I'll just show the rest of the moves as to be a completionist. Rook c8, rook a3, targeting the weak a pawn, in conjunction with the bishop on c4. Rook takes a2. Bishop b3, cutting off the b file, so sort of a safety move to embarrass the queen on b1. f4, that's a little bit of a fancy move, but it's perfectly good. Rook c2, just, again, another fancy move. Grandmasters love to play fancy moves. And out of nowhere, the rook in a5 is trapped, so Gelfand finally resigned here. Excellent game from Karpov. I wanted to include this because it's not a perfect example of how to play. Some of it's a good example of how not to play against hanging pawns. So initially, Karpov chose a bad time to transition to hanging pawns. Again, you want to transition to hanging pawns if you're getting immediate pressure on the hanging pawns, and or you're not giving up the bishop pair to get those hanging pawns. So here, black is sacrificing the bishop pair to create these hanging pawns. That would be okay, or it would be ameliorated if black is getting immediate pressure against the hanging pawns. Here, that's not happening. Black is not getting pressure against the hanging pawns. So his investment of the bishop pair doesn't have immediate compensation. And black's position is passive because this knight on d7, it was forced to go there to protect the knight on f6, but the knight on d7 is quite passive as well. It doesn't have any squares of its own to jump to. So black has to do some additional reorganization. But that comes at a cost because white's playing his own active moves to play for his own. So the course of the game is actually very much in favor of white. We reached this initial position where white's just on the verge of rolling through black. This is as favorable a hanging pawn position as you can imagine. But it just takes that one misstep. f4 is sort of the beginning of the end for white. This is a dire positional misstep that completely guts white's light squares. So especially this square in e4 now is such a potential outpost for black. And it gives black a much better chance to defend. If Gelfand just played h4 here, or there's a couple other options, but I think h4 is the most incisive. This is just a huge position for white. This is virtually winning. But f4 really allows Karpov to finally get a grip on the game. And this move of b5, another reason I wanted to include this game, is you always want to be looking for this b-pawn break. It's certainly one of the first things you need to be looking at in any hanging pawn position. But this is a good example of a position where it's not working. It's not always a universal asset or a panacea against the hanging pawns. It needs to be evaluated completely soberly, just like any other move. Here, it's just not working. Now, immediately, Gelfand plays bishop x g6, which is positionally disastrous. It leaves the light squares completely gutted. And Karpov's eventually able to take advantage of that. But if Gelfand just plays c5, which is the natural move, he shouldn't be afraid of it here, because black's not able to immediately take advantage of those blockaded squares. White's the one that's able to take advantage of his pieces in this situation. And this is just a gorgeous position for white. This is an attacking ideal for the white side. But the course of the game, after Karpov finally got a grip on things, and again, d5, another excellent positional device here. But once Karpov's able to get a grip on the light squares, which is his main positional trump in this case, he really started rolling. And I thought this was a good example of a hanging pawn position gone wrong, where the defending side, Karpov, was able to dig in his heels and play some good chess and sort of dig his way out of trouble. Not without some help from Gelfand, of course, but in general, excellent defensive effort from Karpov. So, very interesting game. We're going to take a look at one more example of a complete hanging pawn model game, and then we're going to round things up with one last video. So, my name is John. I'll see you then.